In a private sitting room deep within the heavily guarded confines of Windsor Castle, Prince William was confronted with a set of documents that, according to the accounts circulating in certain circles, produced an immediate and severe physical reaction. The future king staggered backward against a heavy oak desk, his breath failing completely as the weight of the material presented by Princess Anne took hold. What unfolded in that room was not framed as an official state briefing, nor as routine royal administration concerning constitutional schedules during King Charles's medical treatment. It was, instead, the sudden exposure of a secret that Queen Elizabeth had allegedly kept guarded until her final breath, a revelation so heavy that it forced the heir to the throne down onto his knees in utter shock. Within seconds, the atmosphere inside the castle shifted from quiet protocol to what the account describes as an existential crisis for the British monarchy. The breakdown was not triggered by physical illness or the exhausting pace of public engagements. It occurred at the exact instant Princess Anne opened a dark ribbon-bound dossier bearing the personal seal of the late monarch. Inside were private notes written during Queen Elizabeth's final weeks at Balmoral Castle, detailing what she perceived as a quiet, ruthless conflict rising inside the palace walls. William had entered Windsor expecting a discussion about the Duchy of Cornwall or contingency plans for state duties. Instead, he found himself face to face with evidence, as presented, proving that the institution he was born to inherit was being quietly destabilized from within. The moment Anne read the opening line of his grandmother's final warning, the air left William's lungs, leaving him clutching a velvet chair to stop himself from hitting the floor entirely. Outside the locked doors, long-serving household staff heard the sharp thud of a brass lamp rattling against mahogany, followed by a silence so dense it felt suffocating. Security guards instinctively moved toward the entrance, ready to intervene, but Princess Anne's stern voice commanded everyone to stand down and clear the corridor. Inside, William slowly forced himself back up, his hands trembling as cold sweat formed on his brow. He looked at his aunt, pleading with her to tell him that these handwritten pages were nothing more than the emotional reflections of an elderly monarch weighed down by years of family turmoil. But Princess Anne stood completely unyielding, holding the documents with the cold discipline that has defined her entire public life. She looked directly into her nephew's eyes and warned him that these notes were backed by signed legal directives and that the threat was already moving through the royal household. The physical shock of that moment marked a point of no return for the future king. As William dragged himself into a nearby chair, Princess Anne began unfolding the exact details of how the secret archive was created. During those final quiet weeks in the Scottish Highlands, Queen Elizabeth had realized that her time was short. While the world saw a serene sovereign fulfilling her duties until her last days, behind closed doors, she was conducting private, highly confidential interviews with Princess Anne. The late Queen knew that once her unifying presence was gone, long-suppressed ambitions and personal rivalries would resurface with dangerous momentum. She trusted only one person to hold the full truth without compromise, passing the private documents directly into Anne's custody with strict instructions on when and how they must be delivered to William. The summons to the meeting had arrived without prior warning on the royal calendar. Palace officials had quietly placed unusual security restrictions around the private sitting room deep within the castle, denying access even to senior household aides who had served the family for decades. When William walked into the room, he noticed that Princess Anne was surrounded by several sealed folders tied with dark ribbons. There were no private secretaries present. There were no official recorders taking minutes for the royal archives. Every piece of paper in that room had been brought in secretly, away from the eyes of palace communications teams and political advisors. William initially assumed the meeting concerned administrative matters related to his father's illness, but the instant Anne spoke, the entire reality of his position shifted into something far darker. The late monarch had documented her deepest anxieties, not about political opposition or public criticism, but about internal betrayal. According to the handwritten notes, Queen Elizabeth watched with growing alarm as key figures close to the crown began positioning themselves to shape the future transition of power for their own interests. She observed subtle shifts in loyalty, silent maneuvers among senior advisors, and a growing disregard for the traditional principles of selfless service that had sustained the monarchy for over 7 decades. The late Queen feared that during King Charles's health battles, the vulnerability of the institution would be exploited by those seeking long-term influence over the throne. When Princess Anne read those observations aloud, William felt as though the very floor beneath him had given way. The grandmother he revered had allegedly foreseen the exact fractures currently tearing through the House of Windsor, and she had left behind a warning that demanded immediate action. As the reality of the confession settled over the room, William sat in stunned silence, his posture slumped, his eyes fixed on the royal insignia stamped upon the folders. The room felt colder now, filled with the heavy weight of history and impending crisis. Princess Anne did not offer words of comfort, nor did she attempt to soften the blow. She reminded William that being the heir to the throne meant accepting painful realities before they destroyed the institution from within. She made it clear that the late Queen had given her explicit authority to ensure these directives were executed without hesitation, regardless of the personal cost or family fallout. William realized that the quiet life he had built with his family was about to be swept away by a storm that had been brewing in secret for years. The emotional devastation visible on William's face was unlike anything palace insiders had ever claimed to witness. This was a man realizing that the people he had trusted throughout his life might be the very ones working to undermine his future reign. Every memory of his grandmother's final days took on a new and chilling meaning. He now understood why she had spent so many hours locked away in her private study at Balmoral, why certain long-serving officials were quietly reassigned, and why Princess Anne had been given unprecedented access to restricted royal files. The confession was not just a warning from the past. It was an active instruction manual for a battle that was already taking place behind closed palace gates. Princess Anne slowly reached into the leather dispatch box resting on the table, pulling out a smaller, heavily secured envelope sealed with dark red wax. She held it in front of William, her voice dropping to a low, commanding tone. She informed him that what she had revealed so far was only the outer layer of his grandmother's confession. Inside this final document was the specific name of the individual the late Queen feared most, along with explicit instructions on how William must handle them before it was too late. The atmosphere in the room reached a breaking point as Anne prepared to break the wax seal, knowing that the name written inside would change the royal family forever. The sharp crack of breaking wax echoed through the private sitting room as Princess Anne slid a thick sheet of aged cream stationery across the table. William stared down at the unmistakable elegant script of Queen Elizabeth II, written during her final isolated weeks at Balmoral Castle. Anne did not give him time to recover from his initial collapse. She pointed directly at a heavily underlined paragraph dated August 2022. The late monarch had meticulously recorded private conversations held behind closed doors, while the rest of the world believed she was simply resting in the Scottish Highlands. What William read on that page shattered any remaining hope that his grandmother had passed away in peaceful tranquility. The notes revealed a chilling reality unfolding in the shadow of the declining health of the monarch. While official palace press releases emphasized family unity, Queen Elizabeth was documenting a quiet, calculated struggle for future influence. Senior aides and ambitious family members were already making moves to position themselves for the power vacuum that would follow her death. The late Queen noted instances where long-standing protocol was bypassed, where private royal correspondence was accessed without authorization, and where key decisions regarding the future administration of the crown were being quietly shifted away from the heir. Every entry was precise, timed down to the hour, and recorded with the meticulous discipline of a sovereign who realized her legacy was under active threat. William tried desperately to push back against the horrifying implications unfolding before him. His voice, still raspy from the shock of his physical breakdown, argued that these pages were merely the emotional worries of an aging monarch. He reminded Anne that their grandmother was 96 years old, carrying the immense physical pain of her final illness while mourning Prince Philip. He wanted to believe that isolation and exhaustion had painted normal palace administrative adjustments as something sinister. William insisted that no one in their inner circle would dare execute a silent takeover while the monarch was still breathing on her deathbed. Princess Anne did not argue. She simply reached into the dark briefcase and pulled out a second, heavier folder. She slammed it onto the mahogany surface with a thud that echoed off the ancient stone walls. Inside were not handwritten notes, but official constitutional memoranda stamped by top royal legal advisors, commissioned in total secrecy by Queen Elizabeth herself. This was cold, undeniable proof, according to the account. The late monarch had not been confused or paranoid. She had engaged senior legal counsel to audit internal palace communications, proving that specific individuals were actively preparing to manipulate the succession process during the future transition of King Charles. William leaned over the documents, his fingers tracing the typed lines of the legal audit. As his eyes scanned down to the bottom margin of a confidential security directive, his heart stopped for a second time. There, handwritten in sharp red ink, was a distinct set of initials approving an unauthorized alteration to royal succession protocols. William recognized that handwriting instantly. It belonged to a key figure inside the immediate royal circle, someone who had sat at the family dinner table during holidays and pledged complete loyalty to the crown. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The betrayal was not coming from political enemies or hostile media outlets. It was coming from inside the castle walls. The discovery proved that the quiet power grab had not stopped with the passing of Queen Elizabeth. In fact, according to the legal memoranda, those same individuals had accelerated their maneuvers the moment King Charles received his cancer diagnosis. They recognized that with the reigning monarch undergoing exhausting medical treatments and William overwhelmed with official duties and family pressures, the royal household was at its most vulnerable state in a century. They were quietly altering administrative lines of authority, reassigning loyal staff, and securing access to restricted crown assets before William could ascend the throne. Princess Anne watched her nephew absorb the terrifying scope of the conspiracy. Her face remained a mask of iron resolve as she explained how she had quietly guarded these files for years, waiting for the exact moment when William would be forced to face the truth. She reminded him that Queen Elizabeth had chosen her to hold this burden precisely because Anne had no personal political ambitions within the palace hierarchy. Her sole duty was to ensure that the crown survived the internal rot, attempting to eat it away from the inside. The tension inside the Windsor sitting room tightened into a suffocating knot as Princess Anne slowly lifted a second, significantly thicker dossier bound in black ribbon. She looked directly at William and stated that identifying the unauthorized security changes was only the beginning. Inside this second file was detailed proof of who was directing the entire operation from behind the scenes, an individual whose expanding influence had quietly created competing factional camps within senior royal households. The name echoed inside the high-ceilinged sitting room before William could even draw his next breath: Queen Camilla. Princess Anne did not whisper the words, nor did she frame them as mere palace gossip. She stated the name with absolute precision, dropping it into the quiet atmosphere like a heavy iron weight. The air in the room seemed to freeze instantly. William stood completely rigid, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the mahogany table, refusing to accept that his grandmother's deepest anxieties centered around the very woman sitting at his father's side. Princess Anne laid out the structural timeline with cold efficiency. The late monarch had watched with growing unease during her final months as subtle shifts in authority began quietly reorganizing the balance of power within the House of Windsor. It was not a grand overt takeover, but a series of calculated administrative decisions executed while King Charles concentrated on his demanding state duties and subsequent medical treatments. Senior household advisors loyal to Clarence House were quietly gaining control over press releases, royal schedules, and private access to the sovereign. Queen Elizabeth noted in her final private logs that the traditional balance between the reigning monarch and the future heir was being deliberately altered from behind the scenes. Anne explained how internal factionalism had quietly fractured the royal household into competing camps during the early stages of Charles's illness. On one side stood long-serving officials trying to maintain constitutional traditions. On the other, an expanding network of advisors was working to ensure that Camilla's influence remained unchallenged during the eventual transition of power. The late Queen observed that certain figures were attempting to consolidate long-term authority before William's future reign could officially begin. They were shaping public optics, dictating official appearances, and subtly isolating Kensington Palace from key strategic discussions regarding the future of the crown. William struggled to absorb the terrifying scope of what his aunt was describing. He had known that tensions existed between royal offices, but he had always attributed them to routine bureaucratic friction between Clarence House and Kensington Palace. Now, looking at the chronological records kept by Queen Elizabeth, he realized those frictions were part of a deliberate, coordinated strategy to marginalize his office while his father dealt with complex health challenges. The late Queen documented instance after instance where major administrative decisions were finalized without consulting the heir to the throne, directly violating established protocols that had been respected across generations. Princess Anne turned a page in the file, exposing a series of confidential memos that detailed how communications teams were instructed to frame public optics. Every public appearance, every official statement, and every photo opportunity was being curated to elevate specific senior figures while subtly dampening William's public presence. The late Queen had realized that control over public perception was being weaponized to build an aura of indispensability around certain members of the royal family. She saw that if this pattern continued uninterrupted, William would inherit a fragmented monarchy where his authority had already been undermined before his reign even began. She then revealed a secret that had been kept from every news outlet and royal correspondent in the kingdom. Just weeks before her passing at Balmoral, Queen Elizabeth held a private midnight meeting so restricted that even King Charles was not informed of its existence. No official minutes were taken, no photographers were permitted, and all standard household staff were ordered to vacate the private wing of the estate. Only Princess Anne, a small group of trusted legal authorities, and select senior advisors were present in that room. During that confidential gathering, Queen Elizabeth delivered a stark assessment of the monarchy's immediate future. She warned that emotional vulnerability, internal rivalries, and competing personal loyalties would do more damage to the institution than any external scandal ever could. The late Queen recognized that once she was gone, the delicate piece holding the family together would vanish, leaving William exposed to intense pressure from factions seeking to control the crown's direction. To prevent a complete collapse of institutional stability, Queen Elizabeth quietly drafted emergency directives designed to safeguard William's position as heir. The weight of that revelation hit William with terrifying force. His grandmother had spent her final painful days anticipating the exact power struggle now playing out around his father's throne. Princess Anne reached into the deep pocket of her coat and withdrew a final untouched envelope stamped with the monarch's personal red wax seal. Across the front, written in bold, unmistakable letters, were the words, "For the heir's eyes only." Anne placed the document directly in front of William, stating that inside this paper rested the late Queen's explicit command on how to dismantle the competing factions before they permanently fractured the House of Windsor forever. The crisp sound of red wax cracking apart under Prince William's fingers shattered the heavy silence in the room. He unfolded the thick parchment document slowly, his eyes locking onto the bold black lettering at the top. This was not a diplomatic request or suggested guidelines for his reign. It was a binding command from Queen Elizabeth II, dictated shortly before her death and sealed away until this moment. Princess Anne stood watching every expression on her nephew's face as he read the royal mandate that would dictate his immediate future. The late monarch wrote with uncompromising clarity. She stated plainly that the survival of the House of Windsor depended on William's willingness to place duty above personal affection, guilt, or fear of public conflict. The directive laid out explicit instructions to dismantle competing internal networks formed during King Charles's illness. Queen Elizabeth ordered the immediate revocation of unauthorized administrative powers, the restructuring of palace communication channels, and the total exclusion of non-official advisors from high-level decision-making regarding the succession. Every sentence was engineered to strip authority away from shadow factions and restore control to the legitimate heir. The emotional toll of those words settled heavily upon William's shoulders as he read line after line of severe instructions. His thoughts turned instantly to Princess Catherine and their 3 children, Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis. William realized that executing these directives meant plunging his family into the center of a brutal palace conflict. Protecting the crown required ruthless decisions that would spark retaliatory leaks and public smears from the very factions he was commanded to neutralize. He was being asked to sacrifice personal peace and expose his household to immense pressure for an institution demanding total devotion. Princess Anne stepped closer, her voice dropping to an icy tone. She reminded William that Queen Elizabeth spent 70 years suppressing personal desires, private grief, and family preferences to preserve the stability of the throne. The late Queen made painful choices regarding her sister, her children, and her closest associates whenever the integrity of the monarchy was threatened. Anne made it clear that Elizabeth expected nothing less from William. She then disclosed a critical detail within the document. The late Queen officially designated Anne as supreme executive of these directives, granting her authority to enforce them if William hesitated at all. The legal mandate provided William with precise mechanisms to strike back against internal opposition immediately. The directive authorized him to quietly audit private communications passing through senior royal households, revoke restricted security clearances granted to unauthorized personnel, and override administrative appointments made without explicit written approval from Kensington Palace. Princess Anne pointed out specific clauses allowing William to take direct control of Crown archives and historical records, preventing competing camps from altering or suppressing official evidence of their maneuvers. The late monarch effectively handed her grandson a comprehensive, legally binding blueprint to purge the internal rot from within the institution. A cold transformation took hold of Prince William as he absorbed the true power of the mandate. The grief that caused his initial physical breakdown evaporated, replaced by sharp, calculated resolve. He realized his grandmother had not left him defenseless against the ambition surrounding his father's throne. She spent her final days constructing a fortress of legal protections around his future reign. The period of quiet accommodation and polite diplomacy between royal households was officially over. William knew he had to act with absolute swiftness before the opposition realized their secret maneuvers had been fully exposed. Princess Anne warned William that time was rapidly running out. Whispers about their high-security meeting at Windsor were already spreading through palace corridors, triggering intense curiosity among senior household officials and communications teams. Advisors loyal to competing factions were already attempting to ascertain why private archives were accessed and why standard recording protocols had been suspended. Anne emphasized that as soon as William walked out of that room, every movement he made would be heavily scrutinized. The opposition would react aggressively the moment they sensed their influence was being systematically dismantled under direct orders from the late Queen Elizabeth. William stood up straight, his posture completely rigid and his expression unyielding. He carefully folded the late Queen's final directive, placing it into the inner pocket of his suit jacket next to his heart. The fear that had gripped him earlier was gone, replaced by the heavy, solemn weight of sovereign duty. He looked directly at Princess Anne and gave a single firm nod of absolute understanding. The future king was no longer seeking approval or attempting to maintain artificial harmony within the family. He was ready to execute his grandmother's command and defend the crown at all costs. The heavy iron gates of Kensington Palace swung open into the dark night as Prince William stepped out of his vehicle with an expression so cold it froze his waiting staff in place. Gone was the grieving grandson who had collapsed on the floor of Windsor Castle hours earlier. In his place stood a hardened future king, executing the late Queen's final orders with terrifying speed. Within 30 minutes of his arrival, the palace machine felt the sudden, crushing impact of a major shift in authority. Senior household officers were summoned to emergency briefings without prior notice, catching the entire administrative apparatus off guard. William did not wait for morning or consult with public relations managers. He issued a series of direct binding orders that swept through the royal household like a quiet storm. Security protocols were altered instantly, revoking restricted access for several senior officials close to competing palace factions. Private dispatch logs and internal communication archives were placed under lockdown, effectively blocking shadow networks from wiping or altering official records. Staff members who had operated with total impunity during King Charles's medical treatment suddenly found themselves locked out of key administrative networks without explanation. Every order was issued under the personal authority of the heir, leaving zero room for debate. Across town, senior figures close to Queen Camilla woke to news that their planned media briefings and schedule adjustments had been summarily cancelled by order of the heir. Panic spread through secret messaging groups as advisors realized their quietly built influence was being systematically dismantled piece by piece. They attempted to reach Kensington Palace to demand clarification, but every call was met with icy silence from William's private secretary. The late Queen's legal mandate was already in motion, and there was no authority left in the kingdom that could halt its execution. The shadow network was caught in an absolute trap. In the quiet hallways of Windsor Castle, Princess Anne was executing her own assigned role as supreme executive of Elizabeth's final directive. She met with top legal representatives and constitutional advisors, presenting the signed Balmoral memoranda to ensure that every administrative override carried absolute legal force. Together, Anne and William formed an unyielding wall around the succession, shutting down every avenue that competing camps had attempted to exploit during Charles's vulnerability. The alliance between the Princess Royal and the future monarch created an impenetrable shield against internal betrayal. They moved with absolute synchronization to protect the throne. As the sun rose over London, the sheer magnitude of the late Queen's confession settled into a permanent reality. William had taken back control of the narrative, but the emotional cost of his victory was devastatingly clear. He sat alone in his private study at Kensington Palace, gazing at a portrait of Queen Elizabeth hanging on the wall. He understood now why she carried such an unyielding demeanor throughout her long reign. Preserving the crown required total emotional isolation, a relentless discipline that demanded the sacrifice of personal relationships and family comforts for the absolute survival of the state. The weight of the dynasty was now entirely his to carry. Palace aides who worked closely with William in the days that followed noted a permanent shift in his demeanor. The warm, approachable prince had been replaced by a guarded, deeply strategic leader who weighed every interaction through the lens of institutional survival. He held his private circle closer than ever, refusing to tolerate even the slightest breach of loyalty or subtle attempt to manipulate royal policy. The era of polite compromises between competing royal households was officially dead, replaced by what insiders quietly termed the era of guarded duty. Every decision was made with calculating precision. Queen Elizabeth's final confession, as presented in the account, did not merely save the future of the House of Windsor. It transformed Prince William into the monarch he was always destined to become. The physical breakdown inside Windsor Castle was not a moment of permanent weakness, but the painful birth of an unshakable sovereign forged in the fires of internal crisis. The late Queen's warnings had given him the armor he needed to navigate the treacherous power struggles surrounding his father's throne, ensuring that when his time came, the crown would remain intact. He was no longer just an heir waiting in the wings. He was the defender of the realm. Behind closed doors, the institutional transformation extended to every branch of the royal administrative apparatus. Unofficial advisory groups that had flourished during Charles's health decline were formally dissolved, their access rights stripped, and their correspondence audited by independent legal counsel. William enforced strict new protocols requiring all strategic communications and succession plans to receive explicit written sign-off from his office. The shadow networks that had quietly expanded their reach were completely neutralized, leaving the legitimate line of succession firmly secured under William's direct oversight. The late Queen's dying wish, according to the narrative, had been fulfilled in total.